Kim and Ron walked up towards the steps of the abandoned courthouse. Most of it was covered in vines, branches, and various other plants. The courthouse parking was pretty much almost covered up by grass and weeds. Most of the asphalt was cracked and broken apart from years of decay and elements. The large doors were shut tight with cracks running down the wood, and its handles were still chained shut by the heavy metal chains and a rusty old lock. "This lock looks pretty old and rusty. I think I could break it off," Ron said, upon inspecting the lock. He grabbed the lock and then crushed it with it using his mystical monkey powers, then slid the chains off of the old rusty handles and pulled on the double doors open. The hinges squeaked and groaned from the years of abandonment as Ron opened the doors. Inside the building was brightly lit, since the lights had been from the sun shone through the cracks of the windows. So it was pretty much easier to see inside the place, unlike the old police station. Once Kim and Ron fully entered the building, they found it in an okay condition, except for some cracked walls and torn carpeting from broken glass and tree branches that had fallen through the windows. Ceiling extended about 11 feet, which had vines growing from all above, and through the light fixtures, half of it from rotted wires on the ceiling. Their bulbs had shattered and they were all broken. "This place has seen better days," Kim exclaimed, upon seeing the old mess that the courthouse was in. "Well, 10 years of abandonment will do that to that building," Ron replied. "Let's check the courtroom. Maybe we'll find something there." "Those wooden doors in front of us should lead us there," Kim pointed out, at the two large wooden doors right in front of them. Ron walked up and pulled them open, causing the hinges to creak and groan upon the old doors being opened up. Dust also fell from above as they entered the large courtroom, and their surprise, it was in much better condition than the police station had. However, the carpet had faded in many areas, and some of the witness booths had cracks in them, being abandoned and left alone for so long. The lights were all dark as expected, but the sunlight pouring from the old windows lit the whole room up, giving Kim and Ron a full view of everything. The courtroom smelled musty, almost as an old garage, which they guessed it must have been from the vines coming from the corners on some of the windows. "This place is pretty empty. Think we'll find anything useful in here?" Ron asked, looking around the place. "This courthouse is pretty big, so there's bound to be something in here that we could use for clues," Kim replied, glancing at the small door near the judge's stand. "Let's try the judge's office first." The two of them headed towards the door as their footsteps echoing the abandoned courthouse. It felt as if an eerie being, the only two individuals alone in this abandoned town. Ron was constantly alert for anything strange, and Kim felt uneasy, constantly wondering if they were being watched by someone or something unseen. Kim was pretty sure it was just her uneasy talking, but given that everything that had happened the other day, she couldn't help but feel a rush of fear whenever something creaked or groaned around her or Ron. Ron pulled the door to the judge's old office and found it dimly lit by the sunlight and poured through the set of old closed curtains near the window behind the old desk, with a ratty old leather chair which had a few rips in it here and there. Kim slid the curtain open and light poured into the room, lighting up completely. This room was a bit of a mess, but not like the police chief's office. The office was a rectangular shape with a window, and with the desk being at the end facing the door, and on the left and right sides were the desks near the window, were two large filing cabinets, with 4 of the doors opened up. Some were old files thrown around in the near cabinets, to which Kim and Ron guessed they were old case files. "Let's do some filing checking around the desks. There might be something useful in them we can use," Kim said, then began searching the file cabinets to her left. Ron was beginning to look for the ones on the right, starting with the bottom drawer. There were 2 large files containing thick, stapled pieces of paper, which Ron had took out and inspected. The first one was labeled Todd Farkas case, and immediately caught Ron's attention. "Yo, Kim! I just found something on the police chief, and it's a case file," Ron announced, pulling a large stack of papers out of the file. "Really?" Kim asked, turning her attention towards the stack of papers in Ron's hand. "Yeah, I'm not sure what the other one is, though," Ron said, handing Kim the stack of papers. He took out the second file and had a look at it. It was labeled Evidence Photos. Ron emptied the contents of the folder onto the floor in front of him and made a very gruesome discovery. There were photos of what appeared to be crime scenes, and they were all incredibly graphic. There were some multiple images of young women chained up and what looked like akin to something from an underground bunker, and they appeared to have eaten, beaten, tortured, and even butchered it into pieces. Others were families that had been murdered against their homes or any random outdoors areas that Ron had recognized. There were tons and tons of these, but then came across an image that someone immediately recognized. It was a photo of Ridley's mother, Sarah Farkas, and she almost looked unrecognizable, unlike those tapes that he and Kim saw earlier. Both their forelegs had been hacked off by above her knees, and where she had been beaten and bruised so badly that Ron couldn't almost recognize her. Sarah's face was also bruised and bloodied, but still slightly recognizable, and as she appeared to be in Gerald's basement, from what all Ron could tell. Several other photos were headless bodies of the random house, and they were all mutilated beyond recognition. Yet Ron noticed something that made him nearly puke. One of these headless bodies were of children's bodies. In fact, it made Ron sick to his stomach. There were so many photos like this, and Ron couldn't take any more of it. He shoved the photos aside in disgust, and yet Kim hadn't taken notice of them right away. "Ron, what is it? What's the matter?" Kim asked with concern in her voice. It's all so horrible," Ron stammered, glancing down at the pile of crime scene photos with sickened expression. "What are those?" Kim grabbed the photos and gasped in horror upon seeing them. "Tried to warn you," Ron muttered in a pitiful tone. "Oh, my God!" Kim exclaimed, checking each photo. "What is all this?" "Crime scene photos," Ron replied grimly. "And if I had to guess, I'd say those of Sarah were probably taken by Gerald. As for the other ones, I don't know." Kim continued looking over the photos, and they only got worse. There were images of dead children in animal cages, what looked like some dungeon. There were also photos of taxidermied human heads, what looked like in a storage closet. Once Kim finally got through them all, she was nearly sick. "Oh, this is just horrible," Kim exclaimed, placing a hand on her mouth. "But what kind of town is this? What happened here?" "I don't know, KP," Ron said with his voice grim. "But from what I can read in the paper, from what we saw in those tapes, I can get a bit of an idea of what went down here. These case files might mention something about it as well," Kim speculated, gathering up the case documents. "It's clear that the police chief was not only corrupt, but was also working for Mayor Gerald Farkas as well. From what I can piece together from what we can see in the police station, and from Ridley's story about his past, I'm guessing that Gerald was running some sort of underground criminal enterprise down here in this town." "It certainly looks like it," Ron replied, glancing at the gruesome crime scene photos. "And these are the people in the photos that must have been his victims, or perhaps others that got involved with him. Either way, we should look some of these over before heading out," Kim said, taking a look at one of the case files. Ron then glanced back at the cabinet, then noticed something that he didn't notice before. He saw in one of the bottom drawers of the filing cabinet slightly ajar next to the one that he had just opened moments ago, and there was something poking out of it. Ron reached over and opened up the drawer, finding a large folder that had tons of small cassette tapes inside them, along with the camera tapes next to him. This folder was labeled Video Evidence. Each tape also had a label on it as well, and there were quite a ton of them. "Kim, I found more tapes," Ron reported, showing Kim the tapes. Kim, however, wasn't paying attention. Something seemed to have caught her attention as Ron saw her reading several evidence case files, whatever it seemed to be greatly disturbing to her. Ron glanced down at one of the case files and picked it up to read. It was a disturbing case that had involved a family of 4 back in 1978, and it was from what Ron could gather from reading it. 2 children had been victims of human trafficking, and the parents of these children apparently owned a shady loan company that was secretly owned by Gerald's criminal gang. When they couldn't pay off their loan in time, a group of cops arrested them for false charges of drug possessions and also nabbed the children as well. Instead of being taken to the police station, however, the cops took the whole family down by a secluded location, where they made horrid films involving several family members of Gerald's gang, with the whole family being brutally murdered. And from what Ron could read, The parents were tortured with medieval torture weapons and butcher chainsaws. But as for the children, they were sold to the Mexican cartel by Gerald to be used as human meat delicates. The whole thing had been written off to the public as a drug deal between rival gangs had gone bad, and the family had been murdered as a result. Ron couldn't believe what he was reading. To the public in his town, they had been completely obvious to the fact that their own police force were a gang of criminals led by their own mayor. He had been behind it at all, and his brother Todd Farkas had also been assisting on the crimes as well. None of the citizens knew the truth, and they certainly won't know until Todd was arrested for the crimes of his brother and his criminal organization was revealed to the public. Shit, Ron said, shaking his head. Gerald and his brother were just as bad as Ridley. Now I could probably see where they got most of his evil kicks from. And it only gets worse, Kim said, glancing up at Ron, who shook in from whatever she just read. What is it? Ron asked, glancing at the case that she was reading. Better have a good look, Kim replied grimly, heading over to Ron. God, it's awful. Ron read the case, and he was absolutely sickened him. The case was an underground human meat factory that had been secretly run by Todd Farkas, and it was a place where he'd send all those who had learned the truth about his and Gerald's secret criminal empire, or those that had been deemed problems to the town order. There were photos of human bodies hanging on meat hooks, women being used as breeding cattle, and even some of the children being used as targets for gun practice. This was far worse than the evidence that Ron had seen so far at the meat factory. It was apparently located far underground, about 3 miles away from Dark Wood, and for all who had been sent here would be abused, tortured in ways not even since the Holocaust. Films would also be made of abuse and torture, and would be sold to other criminal organizations by Gerald for profit. And once the victims were dead, they'd be butchered like cattle and their meats would be on the black market. Ron couldn't believe what he was reading. This was like some straight out of a horror movie, and Ron didn't think he'd ever seen something like this in reality. More and more cases, corruption and cruelty was found within the pile. One of them was the 4 high school girls that had been arrested for false charges of and since they've refused any advantages from the group of thugs that worked for Gerald, after being arrested, they were sent to a meat factory to be used and abused by Gerald's criminal organization, and their families were hunted down and simultaneously murdered by the police chief's officers, disguised as cartel hitmen. Sweet mother of God, Ron exclaimed. This is something Dr. Director needs to see. And those tapes too, Kim replied, gathering up the tapes. I wonder if there's anything else we can use in the upper drawers, Ron wondered, setting the files down and checking the other drawers. Most of them were empty, except for the last one on top that has more file on it, along with a small box under it. It was something that Ron didn't expect to see. It was a false marriage certificate proclaiming that Gerald Farkas and Sarah Fevers had been officially married. Upon reading the case file underneath the false marriage certificate, Ron learned that Fevers had been Sarah's maiden name before Gerald had forcibly changed it to his last name. And there were details of how Todd Farkas lied to the public. It said that Sarah had been declared legally dead and called off the search. Was the only deception to ensure that no one knew the truth. And that the truth is, Sarah was very much alive and being held captive by Gerald in his own mansion. And when Gerald had Sarah's parents and family murdered as punishment for trying to escape the mansion, Todd lied to the public and said that they had been murdered Sarah's entire family, then gave several heads to Gerald just to be used as trophies in the mansion. Fevers? Was that Sarah's maiden's last name? Ron read out loud. More case files? Kim asked curiously. Yes, Ron replied, and a lot of them too. I think I saw something else in the drawer. It looked like a box or something. Ron fumbled around at the top of the drawer, then pulled out the small box that had a file, sitting and inspecting it. To Ron's surprise, it had actually been a small cash box with a lock on it, which Ron broke easily with his mystical monkey powers. Inside of it were 4 tapes that had discovered with labels on them, which said Meat Slave Factory Exposed, Mayor Farkas is in Mansion Investigated, Todd Farkas Interrogation, and Sarah Farkas Films Discovered. Ron had a bad feeling in his gut that they were probably going to be very ugly, but still needed them as for evidence. Are those videotapes? Kim asked. Yes, and I don't think we're going to like what they have to see, Ron replied grimly. I have a feeling they're going to be much worse than the ones we've seen so far. This one confuses me, Kim said, upon checking in mentioned Gerald's mention. I thought really destroyed the mansion like you said in that evaluation report or that you told me about. I know, Ron replied, scratching his head. Something doesn't feel right about that. We'll all have to check the 4 tapes along with the other ones too. There's a lot of here that I think we're going to have to go through. Well, looks like that's all there is in here, Kim replied, gathering up the tapes and papers. Let's all get back to the coop and examine it. Yeah, this place has already given me the creeps, Ron said, gathering up everything he found in the drawers. Once Kim and Ron had all the evidence gathered up, they made their way out of the judge's office and made their way back towards the abandoned courtroom. Once Kim and Ron had backed into the old hall, Ron felt his mystical monkey power senses going crazy. Ugh, what the hell? Ron exclaimed, looking around. Ron, what is it? Kim asked worriedly. Something's wrong, Ron stammered, looking around frantically. I sensed something dark. Ron, how could anyone be? Kim started, but then paused when she saw someone, or something, at the end of their hall to the left. What is it, Kim? Ron asked, then turned to see what Kim was looking at. He felt his blood run cold. What looked like a figure of a woman, staring at the very end of the hallway. If only she was pitch black with red glowing eyes. The figure was basically a human shadow form of the red eyes, almost like a ghost. She stared directly at Kim. Ron, about 50 feet away from them. Ron sensed the immense amount of hatred, rage, sorrow, emanating from the shadowy figure at the end of the hall, and it felt hostile. Ron, what's that? Kim asked softly in a frightened voice. I don't know, Ron answered, back softly. But whatever it is, it's not friendly from what I can see. Kim glanced over the exit and then back towards the shadowy ghost figure. We should try and make a run for the door. That thing's far enough away from us, so it shouldn't be able to reach us in time, she whispered to Ron. We could try, Ron replied. I don't know if that thing is capable of, so we better watch out. Kim then nodded and rushed towards the door as Ron kept his eyes on the dark female figure across the hall. She stood completely still like a statue, just staring at Ron as Kim rushed out of the door, and as soon as Ron moved his feet, the shadow figure cocked its head to the side. Then it suddenly rushed towards Ron and breakneck speed. Out of instinct, Ron channeled a mystical monkey power shield in front of himself, causing the shadow figure to dissipate as soon as it ran into the shield. Ron was actually forced back by the shield of the shadow, slamming into the shield, causing him to stumble. Ron, you're all right? Kim exclaimed in shock. Yeah, Ron replied, getting back up on his feet. Didn't see that one coming. Just then he and Kim heard what sounded like a woman's laughter echoing from the courthouse. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder at each second. The area around them got colder, much too cold in fact considered normal. More sounds could be heard as well. There were sounds of women, men, and children screaming deep within the courthouse, and it terrified Kim and Ron. Well, what's going on? Where is this noise coming from? Kim exclaimed in fear. No! Ron suddenly grabbed his head as his voices suddenly began flooding his mind. They were angry voices, all yelling out obscenities like, kill him, murderer, demon spawn, traitor, and so many other horrible words that Ron wouldn't dare say out loud. He had no idea what exactly was happening, but Ron knew certain for one thing, and that was the courthouse was haunted. Ron, what's happening? What's wrong? Kim gasped, frantically rushing to Ron's side. So many voices. They're angry. So angry, Ron yelled, trying to shut the voices out. Kim glanced at the door and then grabbed Ron's fists. Let's get out of here. Run for the door, she practically begged, dragging Ron with her. Ron clutched his head with both his hands as Kim dragged him out. Once Ron made it past the entrance back to the open, all the voices stopped. Ron then looked up and felt the dark presence leave around him completely, and everything was back to normal. He kneeled over and sighed in relief as Kim slammed the courthouse door shut. Fuck, Ron cursed. Ron, what the hell just happened here? Kim asked in a demanding voice, mixed with fear and concern. Ron stood back up, still clearly freaked out by what just happened back inside the building. They were voices in my head, he began to explain in a shaky voice. I think they were ghosts of the past. This building, I think it's haunted by the ghosts of, well, I don't know exactly. Then that's all more the reason to get away from this place, Kim replied. If this courthouse is haunted, what if the rest of the town is? I wouldn't doubt that at all, Ron said, glancing back at the courthouse. Seems like this town isn't so abandoned like we thought. Well, I don't want to stick around here any longer. Let's get back to the coop, Kim said, heading down towards the steps. Ron sure followed Kim down the steps, still shook enough of what just happened. But he had a pretty good idea of what those angry voices were addressing. But there was no way to know for sure. Whatever those tapes they found in the courthouse, they would hopefully be able to provide both Kim and Ron the answers they so desperately needed. But they were pretty sure that those tapes wouldn't be anything pleasant. Two of them were also able to pretty sure the case files would be the same, so they prepared themselves for whatever horror awaited them. And as they headed back to the abandoned parking lot, Ron and Kim read through the last of the case files before finally getting around to the tapes. They had spent at least an hour reading through every single case, and what they found couldn't be more horrible. Kim and Ron had managed to learn how Gerald and his brother gained power over the Dark Wood, and it was horrific. In the year 1970, Gerald had been elected mayor for the townsfolk into buying into his lives, of promising to make the town a lot more safer place due to the rise in crime and poverty within Dark Wood. Shortly after being elected mayor, Gerald appointed his brother Todd Farkas as the new police chief, then fired all the current officers at Dark Wood police stations, and all of his criminal cops employed to their place. With his new plan in motion, Gerald and his brother would now be able to shape through the dark woods. How exactly they wanted? They wanted to use their power to commit some of the worst crimes in history since the Holocaust. To the public, it seems as if Gerald and his brother were cracking down the crime, arresting all of the criminal gangs, drug lords, and various other criminal scum populating the town, ruining the safety of its citizens. In reality, however, Gerald would secretly recruit them into his underground criminal empire, where he was secretly running long before he became mayor. But that wasn't even the worst of it all. As it turns out, Gerald and his brother had actually been the ones mostly in charge of the gangs and drug dealers using the town Dark Wood for their business, and it had been used in various connections with the criminal underworld and to be elected mayor of Darkwood. Once Gerald and Todd, both in power, left Darkwood, this gave them everything they needed to rebuild their region of terror over the town. Gerald ordered his gangs to start extorting any projection money from the citizens of Darkwood, and if they fail, or even refuse to pay the gangs what they owned them, Todd's officers would plant drugs in their homes or cars and have them arrested for false charges of drug possession. Instead of being sent to a prison, though, they'd be sent to his underground slave factory to be abused in their many ways, similar to how people treat their victims in the death camps, such as the history of the World War II. None of the public knew the truth, however, since Gerald controlled the media and would spread out lies of how people were allied with the gangs of dealing drugs. However, as more and more people started missing over the next several months, the people of Darkwood grew suspicious and began looking for what was going on. When the police was questioned about it, they'd always make excuses saying things like, "We're still investigating the disappearances," or "they moved out of town." Some people, however, dug their noses in too deep, and they paid a horrible price for it. Ron read one of the case files of several high school boys found out that a few cops in the town had tortured, violated several of their girlfriends, only to go missing the next day after telling the other cops at the station about it. The evidence stated what the boys were sent to the human meat factory to be horribly tortured and then murdered. Just 2 days after they went missing, their families would disappear as well, and to any who dared to try and look into what Gerald and his brother were doing, and quickly go missing, as well as their families, and then the media would spread false lies about this set over to cover it up. For many years, Gerald and Todd ruled Dark World, and lies and deceit and training. Gerald had always managed to stay in the office due to the connections with the criminal underworld and corruption of politicians that followed him. And all the competitors would be forced to step down under any threats of violence, coercion, or out of fear of their loved ones. For those who were too stubborn or defiant to stand up, end up going missing the next day and would never be seen or heard from again. In truth, they'd been sent to the underground human meat factory and treated the same way the others would be treated there. "This is crazy, KP," Ron said as he read the documents. "This is all going on behind closed doors and no one even notices it." "There's something I don't get though," Kim began. "Remember back in the courthouse when I mentioned that it didn't make sense that Gerald's mansion was investigated? Well, I've been thinking that it's possible that Ridley may have lied to the hospital about blowing up the mansion." "I wouldn't doubt that being possible," Ron answered. "Given how insane he is, he might have lied somewhat about it, or possibly made all of it up just to cover the truth." "What truth exactly?" Kim asked. "Not sure," Ron said, picking up the tape and labeled Mayor Farkas Mansion Investigated. "But I'm betting this tape would give us an answer." Ron slid into his communicator and plugged it into the USB cable, leading to the center of the console. Then, the dashboard screen came up and flipped to the video and it began playing. The video opened up with a little cameraman entering a large mansion with the FBI agents. Then the sound of the officer speaking could be heard. "Shit, there's a lot of blood all over the living room here," the officer off-screen said. Like with the other videos Kim and Ron had seen before Gerald and Sarah, the quality was not top-notch, but still good enough to see what was being displayed. And what they saw was unsettling. The camera moved over to a large, luxurious living room where an insane amount of blood could be seen splattered against the walls and sofa, and there was even some on the peach-colored carpet. As the camera moved around the room, the sound of the FBI agent letting out a gasp in horror as it could be heard in the background. "Guys, you better call the coroner. We've got several dead bodies in here," the agent called out in disgust. "Dear God, it's like Leatherface hacked them into pieces." The cameraman holding the camera rushed out of the living room and into a smaller room, which it looked like a family room or a dining room, and from what Kim saw was horrifying and disgusting. All around the room were dead, mutilated bodies of several men, what looked like they'd been slashed to pieces. Severed limbs, heads, pretty much internal organs were spilled out all over the floor. It was horrid and revolting, and this was still far worse to come. 2 more FBI agents beckoned the cameraman upstairs, and the screen shivered around the room where followed up 2 agents set up stairs leading to the second floor. There was a lot more blood on the second floor, and then there was even a severed human leg lying near the open door. There was even no light coming from the room, so Kim and Ron couldn't see what was in there. Not at first. Most of the lights in the mansion were dimmed, so things weren't very well lit within the area. Once the cameraman entered the dark room and flipped on the light, an absolutely disgusting sight befell Kim and Ron. Hanging upside down were a set of chains bolted to the ceiling was none other than Gerald Farkas. He had both his arms and hacked off with along his head. His body had been hacked and slashed into pieces. Kim and Ron felt sick, not just seeing the horrid sight, but even they had already saw more death than torture before, and the sight of Gerald's mutilated body made them both nauseous. "Oh my God, that's Mayor Farkas!" the cameraman exclaimed in horror.